hopefully you're enjoying not having to come out in the cold and the dark and are all comfortable in your houses. I'll just share my screen with Audrey. So hopefully that will come up in a second. Maybe you could let me know, Audrey, if that's... You're on mute, Audrey, if you're...
Yeah, I'm just unmuting. Yes, that's come up.
Is that the correct, front screen, yeah?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, great. Okay, as Mary says, I'm based in Inverness now and at SEPA, and I did a talk last year on the work that I currently do on aquatic plants and how we use them to look at the health of lochs and rivers, but I promised I would do a talk, one of these sessions on a previous job I had, which was working for a British Antarctic survey. This is quite some time ago now, back in 2000, but hopefully it's still relevant. So I'll just see if my slides will move on. There we go. So people quite often ask me how on earth I managed to get the job, and the job of the terrestrial biology assistant really was to sort of manage the lab that they have in the Antarctic, to carry out some fieldwork measurements and to do some survey work. And I was lucky enough that I just happened to have a quite an obscure range of skills, in that I'd worked in labs at a crop research institute in Dundee, and I'd done a microbiology degree, but I'd also done a lot of field work with British Geological Survey. And I think my upbringing in Caithness helped a lot, because when they asked me in the interview how they thought I'd fare living in an isolated community in an extreme environment where there's low temperatures and extreme weather and not a lot of daylight, then I basically said it didn't sound much different than growing up on a croft in Caithness. So I think they were quite happy with that. So I think first of all, I've got a lot of slides. I could probably talk about the Antarctic all night, but I am going to be very aware of my time. But I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to British Antarctic Survey and British occupation in Antarctica, just because if people have no real knowledge of it, and I'll just do a little bit about the history and base life before I go on to the botany. So just as a little start to the history, this is Port Lockroy, base A, and this was the first base that the British built on the Antarctic Peninsula, and this was in 1943 during World War II. It was part of an operation called Operation Tabarin. And it was a wartime operation, keeping an eye on enemy naval assets down in the Southern Atlantic. But they also carried out some survey work and science when they were there. And then when the war ended a few years later, they kept the presence and actually built several more bases. There was base B, C, D, E, F, G. And Port Lockroy was actually closed in 1962. Because it was deemed not actually a very good place for science, but it had been a very good place for the military operations. So, but fortunately, when they left in 1962, after their sort of 20-year operation, they basically just shut the door and left the base as it is. And in 1996, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office gave some money to British Antarctic Survey to restore it, which didn't actually take a lot of work because the building was pretty secure, and as they'd left everything in it, they easily opened it up as a museum. And being a military base, it was also a post office, and they can also still run it as a post office. So I was lucky enough to do one season at Port Lockroy. And if anybody's ever lucky enough to go on an Antarctic cruise, you'll probably leave Ushuaia in Chile and spend 8 days crossing the Drake's Passage, cruising the peninsula, and you will more than likely end up in Port Lockroy, being the only post office and shop in Antarctica. So I spent from December to March there in 2005, 2006. And we had about 10,000 passengers. We had at least one cruise ship every day from December to March, which is quite phenomenal. I probably hand stamped about 50,000 postcards, as my job was postmistress as well as environmental officer. And at the end of the season, we had about $100,000 in cash in the safe. The penguins weren't there when they first built the base, but they are now. So part of my job was to survey the penguins and make sure that the tourism was having no impact on the island, which it isn't, because they were very used to us. And penguins having no land predators really just treated us like strange large penguins, and we're always just slightly curious and turning up at the museum door. Other sites in the Antarctic are not faring so well with this increase in tourism, with a lot of landings in uncontrolled places and ships having problems. So there is a lot of concern nowadays about the increase, but possibly not this year, because I don't think any cruise ships are running. So that's just a little insight into one of the jobs I did. Sorry, this slide is a little bit blurry. As I said, the British built quite a few bases along the peninsula. Maybe Audrey can nod. Can you see my mouse, Audrey, on the screen? Yeah, everyone's nodding, yeah.
Yes.
So after the war and up until about 1961, many countries were starting to get into science research in the Antarctic and also having a presence. But in 1961, 12 the sort of major countries in Antarctica signed a treaty, the Antarctic Treaty. And the treaty was basically to demilitarize the Antarctic and to establish a zone free of nuclear testing, free of mining and drilling, and it should only be used for peaceful purposes and international science. And that treaty remains in force and now has about 46 countries. But if it had not, you'll see that the peninsula has basically been claimed by Chile, Argentina and the British. So we'll just hope that the treaty stays in place. So the science that goes on now is international science, and a major player in the Antarctic science is British Antarctic Survey. Now I'm going to just run a little 2-minute video, just because I think it, oh, what have I done? I had this all ready for you. Okay, hopefully this video is now.
That's it now.
That's it. Yeah, hopefully this will play. I think this will, rather than just me talking the slides, this will just give you a nice introduction. Okay, hopefully that played okay and your bandwidth can handle that. So that's just a little introduction to British Antarctic Survey. So just a little bit of about the logistics for getting there. So the British Antarctic Survey headquarters are in Cambridge, and they have an onward office that deals with all the Antarctic logistics in the Falkland Islands. So you can either probably spend a month on one of the two ships sailing down from the UK, or about a 16-hour flight. We used to fly with the military from Brize Norton to Ascension Islands. Going back to the Ascension Islands, onwards to the Falklands, or through South America. These are the bases and the science stations that are run and owned by British Antarctic Survey. So from the office in the Falkland Islands, you have 2 permanent stations in South Georgia, Bird Island, which basically deals mostly with albatross, seal and penguin research. King Edward Point is more of a fisheries science station under the South Georgia government. Sydney Station is interesting. It's probably where most of the botany is. These are called the South Orkney Islands. The little islands off the top of the peninsula here are the South Shetland Islands, named so because most of the early exploration and whaling was done by some Scots. Sydney is a summer-only base. Then Rothera, if you remember, Rothera is the station that I worked at mostly and where most of the slides are going to come from. And the other permanent station is down at Halle Station, and the dot's not in the wrong place. Halle Station is actually sited on a floating ice shelf, and the interesting blue pod building that you saw in the video, the reason they built this new pod station is that as the ice sheet moves out to sea, they can drag the building back to where it was every year, and they do a lot of atmospheric research there. Fossil Bluff and Sky Blue are kind of summer only fuel stations and onward sort of camps for getting deep into doing field work beyond the bases. If you remember Fossil Bluff, because I'm going to talk about a little field site that I have just south of Fossil Bluff on Alexander Island. Very quickly, if you've never been to the Falkland Islands, this is Stanley, the main town in the Falkland Islands. Has about 2,000 people living in the town and another 1,000 people living out in what they call the camp, which is the western mainland and all the islands. And there's about 500 military personnel at Mount Pleasant Airport. I think they say there's about 200 times as many sheep on the Falkland Islands as there are people. I think it's very like the west coast of Scotland. It's quite rugged and remote. And in Stanley, there's a little sign, and you can see that Inverness is 9,300 miles away. As I say, it's very. I hate to say it, it's very rugged, like the west coast of Scotland, but maybe with slightly more exciting wildlife. These are Gentoo penguins on a beach just outside of Stanley, and this made the news recently because they actually cleared this minefield. There was about 30,000 mines laid in the Falklands during the war, and only 6,000 were destroyed, and it was just deemed too expensive to clear them, about £50 million. So they were left, a kind of tragic consequence of war, but ironically, it created amazing wildlife reserves because these were huge areas of land that nobody was going on, and the penguins did not adhere to the signage and keep out. But I think this beach has recently been cleared, which is great. And I'll just put a quick snapshot of it is very peaty and very rugged like the west coast, but it has slightly exciting more wildlife like these black-browed albatross, king penguins, many different kinds of penguins and bird life. So but I'll just move quickly on. So leaving the Falkland Islands, we usually travelled by by ship, about 5 days to the Antarctic, which could possibly be the best journey of your life, or as Drake's Passage is said to be one of the roughest seas in the world, it could also be the worst 5 days of your life. If you, especially like me, you have no sea legs whatsoever. But once you get through the passage and into the calm of the peninsula, things get a little bit better. This is the Sir James Clark Ross, which is coming out of service now, and they've sold off the first ship. You've seen a picture of the RRS Ernest Shackleton, and they are being replaced by the RRS David Attenborough, which I'm sure you've probably seen in the news as being built and is doing sea trials at present. The other way to get to the Antarctic is via British Antarctic Survey's aircraft. The one at the back is a de Havilland -7, and it takes about 5 hours to reach Rothera Base, which is the only base with a runway. The little twin otter planes at the front, they're used for doing field deployments, and you'll see that they're fitted with skis that can be lowered and raised depending if they're landing on the runway, or they can land on any crevasse-free piece of snow, which is quite exciting. So we'll just go back to the map quickly. So I'll start off at Rothera Station, which is where I spent most of my time. And sorry, I'm clicking on two presentations at the same time. This is the aerial view as you come into Rothera, and just take a note of the snow coverage. This is at the start of, this is my first flight in at the start of summer, where there's like quite a lot of snow covering the base. You can see the narrow strip is the runway, and the base is situated, and basically Rothera Point is just a low-lying rocky outcrop attached to the rest of Adelaide Island via a glacial ramp. If you've got very good eyesight, you'll see this little trail of where the snowmobiles have been going up to the ski area. So this is a view of the base just from the glacial ramp, coming back down the sea area. So the dark green buildings, there was a new accommodation block built in 2000, and the aircraft control tower. And then you can start to see the snows melting away from the rocky areas behind, where some of the biology life will be. The base holds about, in the summer, about 100 people can be stationed on the base: scientists, tradesmen, engineers, boatmen, pilots. And I signed up for a 2.5-year contract. So during the Antarctic winter, the ships and the planes leave, and basically 20 people are left on base for the 7 months of winter. So we were very busy, about 100 people in the summer, and then about 20 people in the winter, just keep the base going. And at that point, there's no way in and no way out of the station during the winter months. Very quickly, as you've seen from the video, it's quite a nice. It's nice in the stations. There's plenty recreation areas, dining, a chef, plenty of food to keep you going for a very long time. Fully equipped medical centres that either 1 or 2 doctors would man. And then there was plenty of time on base for some fun and recreation outside of the science. So you could join the band. I ran quite a few Kayleys that people were quite keen on. There was a lot of skiing. You know, this is the amount of snow in the winter that's nearly coming up over the winters. And then we had some refuges out on the islands if you fancied a weekend away. So that's a little background. So I better get on to the botany. So the project I was working on in 2000 was basically called Life at the Edge, Stresses and Thresholds. So looking at the extreme conditions where there was terrestrial life around the base and around the Roller area. We were looking a lot at the impacts of the ozone hole and the UV damage that it was being done to the vegetation and the microbiology around the base. But recent day research is doing a lot more on climate change and the impacts of climate change. So the stresses, life at the edge stresses and thresholds. So basically for botany and Antarctica, you have to realize that the Antarctic, they say, is the highest, driest, coldest, windiest continent in the world. So because of its landmass topped with a huge ice dome, then its average height tends to be around 2,300 meters. So very, very cold and very exposed. The precipitation is less than the Sahara Desert. So there are areas where hardly snow, especially in the interior, where snow never falls. And then obviously it is the coldest place on Earth. The Russian Vostok station nearer the South Pole recorded a temperature of -91, I think is the current lowest temperature. And because of the dome shape, you get very high winds picking up off the interior and coming out to the edges. So the highest speeds are about 200. So if you're terrestrial life in the Antarctic, you need to deal with these cold temperatures, low humidity, a lack of soil moisture, and a lack of soil, to be honest, and liquid water. So all these things conspire to limit the plant growth and reproduction. And the life is really only at the edges of the Antarctic. Less than 0.5% of Antarctica is actually snow or ice-free in the summer months. So just a tiny fraction of it. But luckily the British bases on the peninsula is one of the richest areas. So those are the normal stresses. And then on top of that, when I was there, we still had quite big problems with the ozone hole that was just discovered in the mid-80s by the British Antarctic Survey. It's been a while since I've thought about this, and apparently it is closing up, but they don't expect it to fully recover until about 2050. So this diagram shows the thickness of the ozone. Red and yellow is the thickest, blue is where it's thinned at the start of the Antarctic summer. Basically, when the sun comes back to the Antarctic in the summer, it causes the reaction of the CFCs in the stratosphere to break up the ozone and thins the layer. So the UV rays that can come through this thin ozone layer are very damaging to humans through really quite severe sunburn, but was also burning the liverworts and the mosses and the terrestrial life once the snow broke down. So those were stresses, just a very quick introduction. So the very first botanical survey of the Antarctic was done in 1843 by Joseph Hooker, who was an English botanist and supporter of a young Charles Darwin, and he visited the Antarctic as an assistant surgeon and naturalist on Sir James Clark Ross's Erebus expedition. And he compiled a list of the terrestrial plants that they came across on the peninsula, and he catalogued about 18 species. But they reckon the conclusions that he came to were as valid as they are today. So 150 years ago, the conclusion that the terrestrial flora of Antarctica is dominated by the microscopic or lower plant forms, so the algae, fungi, bacteria, lichens, liverworts, and mosses, all bar the exception of 2 species of flowering plant, which is why I'm filling in my time with history, or it's going to be a very short talk. So that was a history. So to the modern day, this is Leone Island. It's not attached to the mountain at the background. So this black triangle is just situated. This is the runway at Rothera, just in the foreground. And this is probably our richest island. So Leone Island was north facing. It has these lovely steep slopes, that would be clear of snow before a lot of other areas, and also had quite a lot of meltwater running down it to keep it wet. So when the snow melts away after the summer, you find these amazing pockets of life appearing in these little sheltered terraces and slopes around the base, but also on the islands. So I'll just focus on Leone just now. So as I said, there's 2 higher plants, and you can just see this Scampsia grass in the foreground of the picture on the right. There's about 75 mosses around Rothera, about 25 liverworts, about 200 lichens, and about 20 macrofungi. And in amongst these mosses, you'll find mites and springtails, which we collected. And all these things freeze during the winter, during 7, 8, 9 months of winter in solid ice under large snowbanks. And then amazingly, once melted away in the summer, they've just about got enough time to do a very small amount of growth. Not a lot of reproduction, but definitely some growth. So if we just have a little bit of a closer look, and I will apologise now, at the time I was there, I had no moss knowledge. And even though I know a few mosses now, I did not write down any of the species on my photographs. So these are some slopes on Leone Island. I'm going to have a very good guess that the sort of main moss that you get around the peninsula is Sanioni eusynctus, used to be called Drapanicladus, sickle-leaved hook moss, which you get in the UK as well, quite ubiquitous around the world. There's also, in amongst that, there'll be some Brachythecium, Ostrocelobrosum, a few Bryum species, Grimmia species, and Polytrichum alpinum species. I think the brown cushion mosses are an Andrea species. They're called rock mosses. There's a few different species of those. The large thalloid lichens are Umbilicaria species. There were 3 different Umbilicarias around the point. I think this one is the largest one, Umbilicaria Antarctica. And you'll see there's some Prasiola algae in the top right, growing in the little crevices. And once in the 5 years that was there, I saw these, the fungi actually produce mushrooms. So that was a 1 in 5 year experience for me. I hadn't seen them until my last season there. You'll notice that the Umbilicaria are quite big, and there's quite a lot of gigantism in the Antarctic, even though things are very, very, very slow growing. They do grow quite large. And I think some of them were guessed at 500 to 5,000 years old. I'll just move on. I'm a bit worried now that Sue was identifying lichens, because again, I'm only really stabbing at I know the top one's definitely one of the Usnea species, Usnea Antarctica. I think this one is. There's quite a few Usnea species and Umbilicaria. I'm going to take a stab at the top right. Black one is Pseudophoebe, and we get quite a lot of the similar yellow and orange lichens associated with bird droppings that you do around any coastline. So I'm thinking this is I'm going to guess again at Xanathoria, but again I'll apologise. I didn't label any of my photographs. So those are the more lower plants. So we'll just move on to the exciting botany now of the 2 higher plants. So there is the Scampsia Antarctica. And this is a very small specimen. Up in the South Orkney Islands and South Georgia, it is much more prolific and bigger specimens. But down on Rothera, it's really getting to the extremes of its range. And we only had a very few small clumps of it around the base. So this is Antarctic hairgrass. And then a small pearlwort, cushion wort, Colobanthus quatensis. I'll just move to the other photo so you can see the names. So these were basically hiding in very sheltered crevices where on quite steep slopes on Leone and at Rothera, where tiny bits of soil and nutrients had been able to collect, where you get a lot of birds nesting. You can see the limpets are where the gulls have been collecting limpets and then feeding on them. And then all the drop limpets would be lying on the shelving, and then you'd find the mosses and plants growing in them. So they reckon these are probably the two plants. When the Antarctic broke away from the big Gondwanaland subcontinent, moved south and become glaciated, there would have been a lot more plants. They've shown, in the video you saw a geologist cracking open a rock and there was a big fern plant, and so the Antarctic continent would have been quite well covered in vegetation, but as it moved south and became glaciated, these are the only two higher plants that have managed to cling on in the extreme circumstances. So a little bit about the science. So this is a lot of the work we were doing back in 2000. We were looking at the micro environment. So there's lots of recorded data from back in the 1950s about air temperature and snowfall, but that's in quite a big wide sense. But what the team I was working for really wanted to know is what was happening in the moss banks and in the soil banks. So we had these meteorological stations set up. So they were recording air temperature, wind speed, rainfall. This is a snow level logger in the foreground that I'm downloading, but there was also lots of, you can't see them, they're quite hidden, probes that were in the moss and the soil. Because basically at the height of the summer on a clear day, these rock faces being exposed to 24 hours of sunshine could reach a maximum of about 20 degrees C, even though the air temperature was around 0. So these plants were living in quite variable circumstances. I'll just show you a quick graph just to show this. So sorry, they're just it's a little bit busy, but the pink line is the soil surface temperature and the black line is air temperature. So as you can see, the soil surface in the summer, so the first half of the graph is in the summer, it's sort of spiking at 15 degrees and then dropping down to 0 at night. And it's doing this through the summer. Whereas the air temperature, although fluctuating, is maybe going from 5 to -5. So there's a clear difference, and you can see the warming effect on the rocks and in the sheltered crevices. Then there's a really interesting, at the start of winter, you can see the first big cold snap we had. The air temperature dropped to -35. But the pink line, you can see it's still only at -10. And that's, we think, most likely due to they're still having some sunshine, there's still sun on the rocks, they're still warm, but they also we had a very big dump of snow that created an insulating effect on the mosses. And then later on in the winter, the next big drop to -35, you can see that the moss and soil also dropped down to below -30 in that spell. And that was because the wind had blown a lot of the snow off and it was a very thin ice layer. And then it was also, there was no sunlight at that time of year. So we used to lose the sun at Rothera for about three months. It wasn't completely dark, it kind of got lost behind the mountains. So we had a few hours of twilight, so you had no warming of the rocks. So so this graph just goes to show the stresses that these mosses go under are everything from 15 degrees plus to -35 below. And these long data sets are really key now for climate change, looking to see how it's changing. So the Antarctic Peninsula is thought to be one of the 3 fastest warming areas for climate change in the world. And this is causing several factors: increasing temperature, there's an increase in precipitation, there's an increase in wind strength and therefore snow scour. You've got a longer melt season and water availability, but also on the other hand, the warmth is causing more evaporation, and in some areas you're getting drier soils. So this native biota had adapted to the conditions it's in for over millions of years, but now it's having to adapt to a much faster changing environment. So they really are starting to see sort of increased productivity and population sizes and ranges. We're just going to jump quickly back up to the south. Oh, I've lost a slide somehow. Did I jump to? No, I just don't have it. Okay, if you remember up in the South Orkney Islands that were off the top of the peninsula was Cygne Island. Oh no, sorry, I'm reading one presentation, but I must be looking at another one. I've got 2 on the go. Apologies. Wait till I just see if I can get the right slides up. I think I shuffled them around just before the talk. No, okay, I can't. Right, I'll just go on to this. They may come in a funny order in a minute. Okay, now where was I? Okay, sorry, it's a little bit busy, but I really want you to sort of look at the lines. So one of the consequences of climate change is that the glacier in front of the Rothera Station, where the ski ramp was, it's been moving back very quickly over the last couple of years. So in 1993, it was at the blue line. In 2005, it had receded to the yellow line, and in 2011, it had receded to the red line. And what they found underneath the glacier was patches of mosses. Now, as I said, they grow so slowly, barely a millimetre a year. So these mosses aren't new colonisations as it's moving back. These mosses were there before the glacier was formed, mainly made up of Bryum pseudotriquetrum, which we find in across all the wet landscapes in Scotland. And basically, the green dots, they took samples of these mosses and they aged them back to 600 years. And they thought that they'd been exposed too quickly and coming back to life, that they would, their metabolism would go too fast and they would possibly die off, but they haven't. They have begun to metabolize and they appear to be growing. So and this is known as a state called cryptobiosis, and they reckon it's a state of life between life and death. Dormancy is when you still have levels of metabolism, but cryptobiosis is when there's absolutely no metabolism, but they're still alive. And now that they've become uncovered after 600 years, they've now been able to grow again. So that's been quite exciting and quite interesting in terms of what happens after like an ice age and when glaciers retreat, and how quickly the mosses and the liverworts can begin to colonize again, because they've managed to stay alive in this state of cryptobiosis. So that's, oh yes, I think my slides are on the right. So those were 600-year-old mosses frozen in the ice. And if we just pop up to Cygne Island, up in the South Orkney Islands, they actually have mosses that they brought back to life after 1,500 years. So as I said, Cygne Island is a little bit botanically more diverse than where I was on the peninsula. You get these quite big moss peat banks. Other people do argue, are they peat? Because peat's formed through waterlogging, but this peat is formed because there's so little decomposition because it's so dry that you get the peat forming. Mostly made up of polytrichum peat forming mosses. And what they've been doing is taking moss cores. You can see the people on the right have got a drill and they're drilling a core out of the moss. After about 20 centimeters, you hit the permafrost. So they're able to drill down and extract a core. And then what they were doing is they were slicing up the core and dating it, and they were looking at moss productivity. But and they find that in the last 50 years, mosses have been growing faster and being more productive. There's been more microbial reproduction. But the interesting was is the bottom of the cores, once they were defrosted, started to grow again, which people were not expecting. So the bases of the cores at the base of this meter stick, which could be 1,500 years old, could come back to life, which is very interesting. So. But the main point of the experiment was to look at climate change and how it's warming a lot quicker. I think 4 or 5 full times more quicker in the last 50 years than it has in the rest of the 1,500 years. So it's going to be interesting to see. They did do a study on Cygnus to look at how the Scampsia and the Colobanthus have changed over this spell, and they have increased their range and their sizes due to the increase in temperature and more productivity and more water availability and more soil availability with the snow melting. But they've also seen some negative impacts through, there's a lot more seals around causing trampling. But then in a positive way, they're also adding nutrients. So there's been quite a lot of changes on Cygnus Island since back in the 1970s, where these pictures were from. So that's right up the top of the peninsula, and you've seen Rothera, which is kind of at the extreme of where the Colobanthus and the Scampsia live. And if we just pop to the furthest extremes of life now. So Fossil Bluff, just a little bit south of Fossil Bluff on Alexander Island was where my remotest field camp was. So these are the exciting days that you get to set off in the Twin Otter Plains and land on pristine remote glaciers and then just get abandoned with a tent and some food. And left for a couple of weeks with your mountaineer field guide to look after you. So the cliff in the background is a 2-step terrace, and the field site I'm going to show you is just at the base of these cliffs, but our camp is just up on the glacier. If anybody's interested in camping, these pyramid tents are used still today and are basically the same design as Scott and Shackleton use because they are so strong and so good for the Antarctic winds. The boxes holding down the sides of the tent at the side are also our food stashes. So you're given military rations, and this is a box for 2 men for 10 days to survive on. So a big bar of dairy milk chocolate each a day and lots of dried food. So down at the bottom of those cliffs, this is the Mars Oasis Met Station. So again, just like at the islands, measuring much less life here, more cyanobacteria and nostoc in the melt pools, and very few liverworts and mosses. So really at the start of where plants are colonizing. So we were monitoring lots of the conditions because this really was where things are starting. Interestingly, one of the experiments that was out is to put these environmental cloches down. So these are basically acting like greenhouses and mimicking what would happen in climate change. So they were sort of letting through different UV levels, and some of them had sides, some of them didn't have sides. So we had a whole range of conditions going on. And interestingly, even after just a couple of years, you can see a faint green tinge there, but after a couple of years, you start getting these mosses and liverworts growing. These were dominated by, I think, Bryum, Plectricum and Brachythecium species. Now the question is, where did these come from? So these glacial moraines have been sort of pushed by the glaciers up against the island, and so there's lots of theories about the wind blowing, coming in with wind blow, air coming from other islands, from South America and circulating around people. There's a thing they call pollen rains, so pollen and propagules just getting into the atmosphere and then being deposited as snow down. You've got birds that visit this area. There's usually some snow petrels flying about. Or have these been here all along since the continent got glaciated, and they've just been clinging a lot on all this time and hardly growing? So I'd love to go back now after 20 years to see if this site has started warming and without the cloches, or is it still look quite devoid of life. Well, this is just a little example. So one of the theories is that the wind you get air taken from the other Cygne Island and the Shetland Islands, and it might circulate around and land on Alexander Island and go up to South America, and so these are the theories as to where these plants are coming from. I think I'll skip the next slide. I need to see that, so I'm getting a bit low on time. Right, very quickly, that's all the botany, but there was a little bit of marine science going on, so I'll just very quickly just go over that. As you can see on the land, it's very white, it's very black, and except for a few bits of moss patches, it really was very black, white and grey. But under the sea, it was incredible. It was like so many different colours, and the marine team were out diving and collecting specimens, and we had an aquarium in the lab, so lots of Antarctic ice cod, starfish, the yellow sea lemons, sea cucumbers, and limpets. I'll just show you a close-up. Incredible, again, with the low temperatures, quite gigantic specimens of things because they're so slow going. And one of the interesting experiments they were doing was looking at sea temperature change. So even a degree of temperature change would prevent, so limpets and starfish get like shoved over by icebergs hitting the shore, and if they end up on their back, they just like stick out a foot or leg and flip back over. And the marine scientists had lots of experiments showing that with a half a degree change, they start getting sluggish. With a degree change, they lose the inability to flip back over, and then are at risk from being predated. So quick sea level changes in sea temperature, it could be quite disastrous for these organisms that have adapted quite slowly. Very quickly, this is the other wildlife that's not botany around the base. So fur seals, so very smelly elephant seals. These are all the things bringing nutrients into the rocky areas of the base. Crab eater seals that popped, and Weddell seals that popped around the base during the winter when I was there. We had lots of whales visit the bay in front of the base, so humpback whales, orcas. You can see this orca's spy hopping the iceberg. They used to have a look at the icebergs, and if there was a penguin on it or a seal on it, they would then nudge the iceberg and try and knock them off to eat them. And minke whales. The bird life on the base that was contributing to the nutrients as well, and the proliferation of lichens. So we had Antarctic skewers. Just going to get my notes. South polar skewers. And these are imperial or blue-eyed shags, Dominican kelp gulls, and Antarctic terns. So they all nested around the base in the summer. like at Port Lockroy, we had skuas, South Polar skuas, nesting all around the base. So we used to, one of my jobs was to monitor the nests and the breeding success to make sure that the base wasn't having a negative impact. And like the skuas, we get up in this hemisphere, they're pretty vicious, and trying to get to their nests to count eggs and chicks were always a slightly hazardous jobs. But I can report that we didn't really have any negative impact on the skuas. In fact, we probably had a positive effect due to the sewage, food coming out of the sewage works. And especially the one that's on my hand, that's George. He used to just basically eat sausages off the veranda if he could get away with it. So very quickly, you can't have an Antarctic talk without some penguins. So these are our most common penguins that were around the base. These are Deli Penguins. The eagle-eyed amongst you might notice that the one in the middle at the back is his head's only half black, because he's a juvenile who's only just done his first molt. So this is the sea ice connected to Anchorage Island, where a lot of the botany, where the first Met station was, and Leone Island in the background. Then we had one very unusual penguin visitor when I was there. An emperor penguin came by for a few weeks stay. He was totally off course. He should have been on the other side of the peninsula. We don't know how he'd managed to get so off course, but he just hung about with us for a couple of weeks, just sort of like giving you a fright in the morning and pecking at your bedroom window. And so it was good. And then I'll just leave you with the last climate change phenomenon that we saw on the base. As I said, it's a very cold and a very dry place, and it's so cold and dry that you cannot make snowballs and you cannot make snowmen. But in my last summer, there was a very warm spell in the summer where the snow did become soft enough to make a snowman. So, but hopefully with climate change, you won't be seeing too much of that. Okay, I know, I'll stop there.
We're still seeing your screen, Mairi.
Okay.
There we go.
Can I say a big thank you to Mairi? That was absolutely fascinating. I think we're never going to get to Antarctica, so it was absolutely wonderful to hear about all your tales and your adventures. And I'm sure you'll be happy to answer any questions. So I saw there was one there from Fiona. Where was that gone? I've lost it now.
I could ask it again if you like.
Right, that would be brilliant, yes.
I was just wondering if there are 600-year-old or 1,500-year-old fairly dead but not completely dead mosses under the glaciers. Has the glacier gone in a different direction, or was it warmer at those dates, or why are they there? Or why were they there?
Yeah, I don't know if they'll ever know, but they did the carbon dating and they're 600 years old, and I don't think anybody really knows how back to like, because the Antarctic was higher up and then it moved down, but that was millions of years ago. So there may have been a time when that glacier was just a lot further back, and just over time it's just crept forward, and there were maybe mosses there, and then they've just become covered up over time. And they only realized that they were there when it's moved back in a very quick space of time. They definitely were there from the first year it moved back, so they knew that it's not something that's grown already. And then of course when they carbon dated it, it turned out they were 600 years old. So it must have been free. It just had to have been free of year-round snow and ice at that point 600 years ago. The glaciers are always moving every year, so yeah, maybe it's just that was the point when it got to that point.
Yeah, I suppose like rivers, they drift across as such.
Yeah, so they all quite move in different areas. So there may have been a brig if the glacier had come to the edge and a huge bit had broken off, maybe that 600 years ago, maybe that exposed a bit of land, and then it's grown, and then the glacier sort of crept back in again, and then it's not broken off as big a bit for a while. But where that moss came from in that time, whether it blew in or came from the rocks nearby, yeah, it's really
Thank you very
interesting.
much.
Any other questions?
Oh, I've got a quick one. It's not about botany, but I was just wondering, was anybody studying tardigrades down there? Because they're well known for being able to survive sort of very low temperatures and sort of go dormant for centuries at a time.
Yes, Pete Convey, who I worked for, he's a specialist in all the mites and the springtails. That, in fact, I did have an SEM image, and I took it out, and they've shown experiments where they've frozen them in ice cubes and left them for years and years, and then they've defrosted them out, and then there's just a wee shake of the leg, and off they go. And it's all to do with it. They kind of expel all the water out of their bodies that they can, and the water that is left in their bodies they fill with an antifreeze, and then that seems to allow them to stay in a state where they can just be alive and no more. So
yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. There are many papers by Pete Convey, on the Antarctic arthropods.
Thank you.
What about sun protection? Did you have to plaster yourself with sun cream all the time?
Yeah, in the early summer, especially when the ozone hole, I have never seen such bad sunburn than this Glasgow builder that came down, and it was my job to tell people when the ozone hole was open and damaged, but he wouldn't believe me. And after, because as it's reflecting, you not only get the sun coming down at you, it's reflecting off the snow and on the water and coming back at you as well. And it's 24 hours in the summer. You know, the sun dips down and it just doesn't quite hit the horizon and comes back up. So the UV coming through the thin ozone. So penguins were getting eye problems, and they were finding seals with eye problems with the UV rays. But luckily they've had a few seasons where the ozone hole is really not opened as much. It was less than half its thickness when I was there, so very damaging. I don't know what happened to the microbiology studies we were doing. We were sort of looking at how it was impacting on the liverworts and the fungi and the bacteria. And they did a lot of interesting projects with NASA because it was such extreme circumstances. The British Antarctic Survey work a lot with NASA when they were looking at putting probes up to Mars and looking at the conditions up there. So they were trying to make parallels. So.
Is that another question from Pete Gordon? Are any of the bryophytes endemic, or where are their affinities?
Yeah, so I skipped a slide, and all the bryophytes you can find in South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, I think. As the continent broke away, I think they all had the same flora and fauna, and then as it's glaciated, just the toughest of things have stayed around the edges. You don't get a lot of migration in because of the Southern Ocean circles around and the wind circled around a rock, but you do get some like that wind sort of, they think things are blowing in on the wind, but not from very far at all. I think there's one or two species that they've only found in the Antarctic, but I think with bryophytes, maybe if you looked hard enough, you might find them on the bottom of those southern continents. But I don't know. I'm really not that versed in it.
Has anyone got any other questions?
I feel I must just ask about your very first slide. What's happened to your lab coat in the middle photo? The very first slide.
There was a murder mystery party, and I used it for the murder mystery party.
That's good to know.
I didn't show any slides, but unfortunately that lab, I signed up for 2.5-year contract, but I had to leave after 18 months after just my first winter, because at the end of the winter, we had a massive fire and the whole lab building burnt down. And we were exceedingly lucky that it was an electrical fault in the building, because we were just really lucky that the science building was actually set far apart from all the accommodation and all the other facilities, because, oh my goodness, there was no way to control it, and we just had to let it burn. So that
sounds terrifying.
Can I ask a question about what it was like living there? I've just been reading Sarah Wheeler's book, Terra Incognita, written in 1996. And she arrives at Rothera and is the only woman there and finds it very, very difficult. And I'm just wondering, you're there probably 5 or 6 years after her. And by then, clearly there were women on the base. She went there as a writer, not a scientist. So I'm just wondering what it was like, for you.
I read the book before I went, and it did make me worry, but I didn't find that at all. We were kind of outnumbered. I think the first women came in the mid-late 90s. They got rid of the dogs and brought in women, which some people thought wasn't such a good idea. But we were probably outnumbered 10 to 1, but by the time I was there, yeah, it wasn't an issue or
it changed
or a problem. And I think nowadays, I don't know what the ratio is now, but yeah, I never had any problems. Yeah, I thought her book was, I don't know, she's a writer. It was maybe just a little bit not over the top, but yeah.
I think
it wasn't true to my experience on the base.
That's good, because I mean it showed just a stark contrast between her experience on the American side of American, Italian, New Zealand bases, and then coming to she's just not long arrived at the British base. So it seemed to be such a different atmosphere in the bases. To me, reading it now, it felt like it was maybe the 1950s rather than the 1990s. I had to go back and really check the date because of the attitudes and behaviour then. But you're right, she could well have exaggerated it for artistic effect.
Yeah, by 2000, yeah, there were no issues. We had your tendency to get your own room just because there was a lack of other girls to bunk up with, and the ratio of toilets to women was better.
Any other questions? Well, just a big thank you, Mairi. That's absolutely wonderful, giving us lots to think about. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a lovely Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you.